My guest is Laurie Ness-Gordon, author of the book Finding Home. I'm so glad you came in to talk to me today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And because it's such an interesting subject, and it's one I think a lot of people don't know much about, and that is the home children. So tell us what home children are, who they were.
Home children are young children from the slums of England who were brought to Canada as cheap farm labor or domestic help. They were usually brought over by organizations. Bernardo is the most commonly associated name with home children, but there were many other individuals and organizations as well that brought children to Canada.
And it was really any of the UK countries, Australia, South Africa, also, and this wasn't just a pilot project that went for a little short time. It went, how many years did this go on?
It started in 1869, and depending on who you ask, it was going into the 1930s, 1940s. And so it lasted a long time, and approximately 10% of Canadians, according to the British Child Agency, are descendant from home children.
That's amazing, isn't it? And you know, that's why I find it so interesting. I have friends whose parents were home children, and one told me that her mother was so young, and she was working in a restaurant, that she had to stand on a box to wash the dishes in the restaurant. She was a dishwasher, and she was that young and that small. So you can imagine, and so she had no education. It's really, you know, when you think back, the way we treasure children today and indulge them, and here these kids were basically throwaways.
The youngest ones sometimes were adopted, but there were many horror stories about the mistreatment of the older ones that came to Canada.
At the very best, they worked hard. They did. Yeah, they worked on farms, and they worked very hard. And then at the worst case scenario, they were flat out abused.
That's true.
Yeah, but then it was a time when that sort of thing went on in families too. That kids were not dealt with as delicately as put it nicely, and put as they are today. But and I understand a lot of these children were told that their parents were dead. So
that's true, and sometimes the parents couldn't afford to keep the children, and so they ended up in the poorhouse. And the children often were wandering the streets or begging, and they were taken in by people like Bernardo or Andy McPherson, and she's the one that's featured in Finding Home. And they were often told that the parents were dead. And there are a number of novels written now available in the library and so on that feature home children who are looking for their parents or looking for their siblings because they were separated.
And it's quite possible that they would have siblings somewhere that either were also home children or maybe stayed back in England and managed to dodge the authorities. And so they would take these kids as young as...
Sometimes 3 or 5, and
wow.
It depends.
Right up to teenagers, and they put them on a ship, and they would find themselves in this strange, very cold country, and collected at the station by people who, okay, get to work, kind of thing. Yeah.
In the research that we did for this book, we discovered that Annie McPherson had a distributing home in Belleville.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, they still, I think it's still there, the Bernardo home?
No, it's not a Bernardo home. Bernardo did use it, but Annie McPherson was the first person who brought children to Canada in 1869. And so Marchmont Home is still there. It's an apartment building, and not the original one because it burnt. In fact, there were several fires there, but it's still on that particular street, the last home of Marchmont.
It's near the downtown, as I remember. I remember somebody pointing it out to me once, that what it was, and yeah, and that was, I believe, the first one, way back, and then there were others that were established after that. So, what were these homes for?
Basically, when children came to Canada, they stayed in these homes until they were basically sent off to farms or to domestic situations. And there were lots of them. Annie McPherson had another one in Galt, which is now Cambridge. Maria Rye had one in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Quarrier had one in Brockville. There was one in Knowlton in the Eastern Townships. One that I can't think, near Halifax as well. So there were a lot of homes.
A lot of these. Were these industrial homes or workhouses or?
No, they were just distributing homes, so the children stayed there for a very short time because they were really in demand. Canadian farmers really needed help, and so they would line up to take these home children. So they didn't stay in these homes very often, but where they came from in England, for example, Bernardo had the East End Juvenile Mission, and Annie McPherson had the Home of Industry. And so she took children there. She introduced them to the Word of God because she was an evangelical Christian. She gave them some training, and they stayed there for a longer period of time until they could be sent to Canada.
Okay. I know it's hard to imagine, but then I also understand that these children, you say, well, why didn't somebody do something about this? We get on our righteous soapbox about that. But they were thought of as thieves and no good, and if they weren't thieves, at least their parents were. I mean, probably true, that's what survival is. So even if you knew the farmer next door had a bunch of these kids and was abusing them, so what? They were really no good kids anyway.
That's right, and with that kind of stigma, it was no wonder that the child immigrants were reluctant to identify themselves as home children, and that continued for years.
Oh, well, yet obviously they somehow came out of it. They ended up, well, who knows how they ended up, but a lot of descendants as a result of that. Now your book uses that as the backdrop, but tell us about Sarah.
Sarah is a young girl who was 16 when the story opens. She was orphaned by cholera in England, and her employer, Curate Seaton, offered her accommodation, but his wife was not happy with the situation, so she wanted Sarah gone. And so the story revolves around Sarah's search for her family. And it happens that she discovers a letter from her mother's much older sister who happened to live in Canada. So she's the first character that you introduce in the book. And the second one is Richard. And Richard is sort of a local boy. He lives in Forest Mills, which is about a 10-minute drive north of Napanee. And he's the disgraced son of the sawmill owner in this little community. He has lost his job at Gibbard's. And so his father is not at all pleased with the situation and tells his son, you will work in the sawmill until you've paid back all the money I wasted on that education at the Newburgh Academy. And then you'll go and make your own way. And those two stories are brought together by the group of home children. And
then a romance, of course, between these two young people, and so it has a somewhat happy ending, but
it's not a happily ever after ending at all, but it is hopeful.
Okay, we won't give away anything more than that. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's a hard to believe, but almost shameful part of our history that we should all be aware of and understand that, this sort of thing went on. And it went on not just here, but a lot of places. And so you've written this book. It looks like it's an interesting book, and you can get it at Novel Idea. And where else can we get it?
A Novel Idea, yes, because I want to support independent booksellers. It's also available at Books on Main, which is a lovely little bookstore in Bath. Truesdale's General Store in Sydenham has copies of it. And if you want a little road trip, you can get them at Upper Canada Village as well, or come and see me.
Good to know. This is so interesting and such a good subject. I'm so glad you wrote this book. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you, Donna. My pleasure.